The Atari 2600 had one of the longest lifespans, from 1977 all the way to 1992. That's weird to think because the Super Nintendo was out by then. How did this console stay alive for so long when the others did not? Let's take a look. What's going on? It's Pojer, coming at you with another video. Well, we did it. We hit 30k subscribers. I really wanted to thank you all for helping me get there. It's been almost 2 years since I started making weekly content, and it's been going really well. If you want to help me reach that next milestone, I don't know, maybe 40k, 50k subscribers, just hit that subscribe button right there. Speaking of milestones, we're at 500 members on Discord. Not that the quantity matters, what matters is that we have a great community over there. Just go to discord.pojer.net. Anyway, let's talk about the Atari's long lifespan. In 1977, Atari released the 2600. It wasn't the first console to take cartridges, but it was the first to do it well. The hardware was acceptable for its time, but the age would show within the next couple years. Companies were already making consoles like the Intellivision and ColecoVision that had superior hardware over Atari's console. Despite that though, the 2600 outlived them. Even Atari's own consoles, which were meant to replace the 2600, died before it. The console was even still alive when Nintendo was dominating the market with the NES, and even the early years of the 16-bit era. How did the Atari 2600 survive for so long when other consoles did not? Let's get started with the list. Number 1. Bank switching. When the 2600 was first released, the hardware was meant to support Atari's more basic titles that were in the arcade. With that said, cartridges could only support up to 4 kilobytes of ROM space, which was perfectly acceptable because games like Combat only needed 2 kilobytes. But in the later years, this 4 kilobyte limit was becoming harder and harder to stay within. If that's not enough, Atari's competition was releasing consoles that could support more ROM space by default. This is one of the biggest problems with home consoles. With technology getting better, existing consoles will look more obsolete. It's not like you can send out a system update to improve the performance, you're stuck with the existing limitations. But Atari came up with a neat idea. The game Asteroids was a huge success in the arcade, which meant a home console port would be on the horizon. But there's no way a game like this was possible with only 4 kilobytes of ROM space. Atari would utilize the trick bank switching. By partitioning out an 8 kilobyte game into 2 4 kilobyte fragments, the console could support the larger game. Suddenly, Atari had a way of extending the lifespan of the console a bit longer. This made the 2600 not look so bad against the competition. With bank switching, newer releases could be much bigger and feature more programming tricks than before. For example, the game Solaris, which was a 16 kilobyte cartridge, was a huge graphical achievement. The graphics had a lot of detail in the background, and some of the 3D effects they pulled off were impressive. More on this game later. Without bank switching, it would have been harder to compete against newer consoles. Number 2. Failure of the 5200. The Atari 2600 dealt with some fierce competition within the first couple years after its release. The Intellivision came out in 1979 and had some significant hardware advantages. The console had 4 kilobytes of ROM space built in that contained the necessary components for building a game. The games could also support up to 4 kilobytes as well, so essentially you're getting up to 8 kilobytes without the requirement of bank switching. The sound and graphical capabilities were also better. The console supported way more RAM at a whopping 1K, which was far better than the measly 128 bytes, not kilobytes, that the 2600 supported. Atari's console would only look worse when the ColecoVision came out in 1982. This console was a powerhouse compared to the previous two, with 16 kilobytes of video RAM. Game cartridges could carry up to 32 kilobytes of ROM space, which was a gigantic number for the time. The console also had definitive versions of classic arcade games like Donkey Kong. You could tell by the graphics too that this was a far more powerful console than the 2600. Atari was feeling the pressure and decided that they needed an answer to these superior consoles. The result was the Atari 5200. This console had similar hardware specs to the ColecoVision, with 16 kilobytes of RAM and cartridges that could support 32 kilobytes of ROM space. The games did look noticeably better than Atari's predecessor, but there were some serious issues with the 5200. The console had a poor lineup of games, only 69 total, with most of them only being upgraded versions of 2600 games. The controllers were also very unreliable and they broke easily. The biggest problem though was the lack of backwards compatibility. 5200 owners didn't have access to the 2600's excellent library of games. Unfortunately for Atari, the 5200 would be a commercial failure, so it was back to the 2600. The home console market would become very quiet from 1983 to 1985 because consumers were not interested in video games. Atari is commonly blamed for this because of some of the mediocre games they created and the failure of the 5200. As a result, the original Atari Inc. would break up into two companies. Atari Corporation would inherit the console rights and all the properties. The CEO, Jack Tramiel, saw no potential in the home console market and decided to focus on the computer market instead. When Nintendo revived the home console market in 1985, Atari Corporation would capitalize on it by releasing the 7800, which was previously shelved. Jack Tramiel would also give the go-ahead to start releasing 2600 games again. The 7800 was a much better console than the 5200, featuring backwards compatibility and more reliable controllers, but the NES had a better lineup of games and debatably better hardware depending on who you ask. No matter how hard they tried, none of Atari's newer consoles were able to replace the 2600. Had the 5200 or the 7800 taken off, there's a possibility they would have discontinued the predecessors sooner. Number 3. Adaptation. The Atari 2600 was a much different console in 1987 than it was in 1977. In 1977, there was no standard yet with game consoles, so a lot of things were primitive. Most of the settings are on the console itself using dip switches. A majority of the games were 1 or 2 screens with very little content. This is partially due to hardware limitations. There's not much you can do with only 4 kilobytes of ROM space. I do have to be fair though, a lot of 2600 titles were arcade ports, which were also primitive for the time. Most games had variations you could choose from, but you needed the instruction manual to see what they were, otherwise you would just have to guess what number does what. There was no such thing as a menu screen back then. This all sounds bad, but again, there was no standard that had been set yet. Future consoles would improve on some of these standards, but the one that sticks out to me the most is the NES. The games on this console started having actual menu screens, even if they were just as basic as selecting 1 or 2 players. A majority of the games were also not just 1 or 2 screens, you were getting full-length stages that scrolled horizontally. It only got better over the years thanks to mappers giving NES games more capabilities. With the success of the NES, Atari, now under Atari Corporation, decided to repackage the 2600 to better fit the standard at the time. It was given a more modern redesign and the price was dropped to under $50. The commercials would talk about the fun being back and showcase some of the better looking 2600 games. There was a 2-year hiatus where Atari was not publishing 2600 games because of the video game crash, but with the repackaging of the 2600, they resumed developing games for it. With the standard being different, we would see some higher quality games. Some of the old primitive aspects of games would also be improved. The first published game since the revival was Track and Field, which is a console port of the Konami game. You're in the Olympics and you must participate in various events. In the running events, you press left and right repeatedly in order to run. The faster you do it, the quicker you go. In the throwing events, left and right is used to increase your speed, but the fire button is used to throw. The game uses a 16 kilobyte cartridge, which is no surprise considering how much content you get. There's 6 events in total, which is extremely impressive for a 2600 game. The graphics are well detailed and hardly looks like an Atari game. The text is surprisingly small and the vertical scrolling looks excellent. There's even parallax scrolling in this. The title screen is an example of the standard changing. The fact that there is one at all is different, but notice that you're able to see what each gameplay variation is without needing the manual. This is a huge technological achievement in one of the best 2600 games. It's too bad we'll never see this one on collections like Atari 50. Here's Midnight Magic. This was a game that was planned to be released years earlier but was shelved during the video game crash. It's a standard pinball game where you must obtain as many points as possible. The best strategy is to touch the colored block that has an arrow pointing at it. You could regard this as a follow-up to Atari's previous game, Video Pinball. This was a good game for its time, but the board looks very flat and the ball is too floaty. The flippers almost have no use, and there's no way to activate both of them at the same time. And let me ask, have you ever seen a real pinball machine that looks like this? Midnight Magic looks much better graphically and feels more like a real pinball machine. Plus, you can use both flippers at the same time. This is the superior game, and Atari was right in resurrecting this one if they want to compete with the NES. Junior Pac-Man is another game that was shelved until the revival. I can't talk about impressive 2600 titles without discussing this. Junior Pac-Man is not well known because it's not officially recognized by Namco. It's like the original, but the stages are much larger in size. The bonus items are actually a hindrance in this version because they make the pack dots harder to eat and they destroy the power pellets, which you don't want. This is a surprisingly large game that has 7 stages, just like the arcade version. It's impressive they retained the scrolling too. The only thing I don't like about this game is that it still uses the primitive game variation menu, which you need an instruction manual for. Despite that though, this is another excellent title that Atari needed if they wanted to battle the NES. Another game I can't ignore is Solaris. I haven't talked about this one in great detail. You play as the Star Cruiser and you must defeat the Xylons and defend your own planets. The Xylons and planets are all on this menu screen. By selecting one of the enemy icons, it brings you to a shooter area where you must destroy everything in sight. Along the way, you run low on gas. By returning to your main planet, you're able to fuel up. On the enemies' planets, you can save hostages. As you make it further in the game, you're introduced to new enemies. Some of them are able to destroy you in one hit. If you lose 3 times, the game's over. The game honestly looks incredible graphically. When you're on a planet, the background is surprisingly well detailed, almost like an NES game. When you're in space, you can move the screen in 8 different directions, which is impressive for an Atari game. This is a shockingly large and complex game. This is usually one of the first games Atari would show in commercials for the console, and it's no surprise considering how impressive it is. Here's MotoRodeo. You play as a monster truck and you must beat the stage before your opponent does. It's a completely 2D track where you have to use the ramps to avoid the hazardous terrain. The water is the one you absolutely want to avoid because it eats a lot of time on the clock. Your best strategy of winning the race is by collecting the green turbo boosts. These let you jump and allow you to skip a portion of the level. I'm impressed they managed to accomplish horizontal scrolling. I really have to compliment the menu. On the title screen, you're able to select what tires you want. On the next screen, you have many gameplay variations to choose from, including difficulty settings and a practice mode. This is really impressive on the Atari. This would have been unheard of 5 years ago on this console. The game itself is okay, but I find it unfair. You never know what's ahead of you until it's too late, and because it's completely in 2D, you have no choice but to crash into random objects. Despite that, this game is a huge technological achievement. It was clear with these games that Atari was adapting to Nintendo's standard of bigger games and actual menu screens. Atari knew the NES was better, but by marketing their console as a cheaper alternative, maybe more people will join Team Atari. Their later titles were also higher quality and easier to pick up and play. These changes helped keep the 2600 relevant for a bit longer. I just wanted to give you a breakdown of the things that helped keep the 2600 alive for 15 years. Atari Corporation would discontinue the 2600 and 7800 at the same time in 1992. Part of the reason the 2600 lasted for so long was not on purpose. Atari wanted to jump ship, but none of their newer consoles were successful. Instead, the company published more and more games that pushed the hardware limits and adapted to the current standard at the time. Atari also cleverly marketed the 2600 as the cheaper alternative to the NES. It's amazing to see a product from the 1970s last until the 1990s. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.